I'm Dennis Taylor, and welcome to today's session on pivot tables, part one. In this session, we'll be talking a lot about this great feature. It's one of Excel's best analytical tools for sure. It's ideally designed to help you manage data, specifically large lists of data. Now, it's no secret that many people these days are getting large lists of data from other sources. Sometimes we want to make sense out of them. The list that we're seeing on the screen right now in this workbook, it's called appliance sales. It's not in any particular order. And anytime you are working with lists, by the way, particularly if you're going to be sorting it or filtering it or adding subtotals, you always want to scope out your data ahead of time. Now, the pivot table feature that we're going to be showing you is a little bit tricky to describe without an example, but at least we can set the stage as to what we want to do, and then perhaps give you a real rationale for wanting to use this feature. This list is about 900 rows or so. When you do have a list, by the way, if you click on a cell and then double click the bottom edge, as I'm about to do here on cell B6, this zips us down to the bottom. We see it's 912 rows. Now, if this was sent to you, what is it you're going to be doing to make sense out of the data? Without going through all possibilities, if we go to the Data tab in the ribbon, and by the way, I'm using Excel 2013 in the example. If you're using Excel 2010, Excel 2007, nearly everything we do is going to be the same. There are a few additions, and I will point out those differences as we work with them. On the Data tab, there's a button here for sorting, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with how to work with that feature. It's a great tool, and anytime we're trying to manage our data, it's certainly, if not the number one thing we do, certainly something we get to pretty quickly and easily. We could easily sort this data by salesperson or product or whatever. It gives us some sense of order so we know what's going on. The filter button just to the right of it is also a great tool. It helps us manage our data because sometimes, although we're not fully analyzing it, we just want to view, let's say, certain products or a combination of certain products within certain regions, or maybe even narrow it down by salesperson as we wish here. And so with this kind of data here, there are all kinds of useful things we can do with those two features. And another one out here, maybe less frequently used, called subtotal, is also ideal because if we do have the data in a particular order, say it was sorted by salesperson, we could come up with subtotals by salesperson. But there's still something about this that's missing. And that's the idea that you'd like to come up with some good summary information and also have the ability to quickly change it and shift the focus. Now, in this list here, if you've heard about that pivot table feature but haven't quite gotten a handle on it, or maybe you haven't used it just yet, you can't just say out of the blue, well, I've got a bunch of data. I've heard this pivot table feature is great. Why don't I just use it to make some sense out of it? In order to work with data that's going to be used in a pivot table, you got to make sure that your data meets three basic criteria. The first one is, through the data here, make sure there's no empty rows all the way across the data. And one thing that will help in discovering that, if you're not too familiar with the data, is to click anywhere within the data and press Control A. Now that's going to highlight all the contiguous data nearby. Now you can either scroll up and down, but that's going to take you a while, and to get to the bottom it might, but you might discover an empty row in there somewhere. And if you did, the gray area that's highlighted wouldn't go below that. And by the way, if you press Control Period here along the way, just Control Period a few times, this will move the active cell around the corners of the range, and that sometimes is a quick way to get a handle on this. If you are familiar with the data, of course, you don't have to do this, you know. There could be some empty cells in here, that's okay. Make sure there are no empty columns, that's much less likely. And usually a quick glance at the column letters indicate that that's not the case, so we don't have that. The third thing to do, not so obvious, but pretty easy to adjust, is the idea that we want our field names, our headings here, and actually the term field names isn't quite accurate, but nevertheless, the headings at the top of each column should be unique, and they should be in a single row. If you've got multi-row titles, suppose this said regional salesperson or something like that, redesign these titles, get them into a single row. If you have additional title information like I do up here, just keep that separate and isolated from your data by at least one empty row. Now, what we're about to show you with the pivot table, first of all, think of the pivot table as a separate entity which we are about to create, separate in the same sense that maybe a chart is separate. A chart is based on data that you have. A pivot table is based on data that we have. It's going to exist either on this worksheet or on a different worksheet, but it will allow us to create summary information quickly and easily with a great deal of flexibility. Now, you don't know the data that well unless you've been looking at it for a long time or working with it for a while. But let's say what you'd like to be able to get out of this, at least initially, would be something like this. How about a list that shows our salesperson's names down the left-hand side of a list? Now, there are 12 different ones here. Imagine 12 different salespersons, and then across the top, a list of regions, and maybe below that, and below the regions and to the right of the salesperson, how many items each person has sold by region. Now, I've done this manually out in column I. I'll just bring it over here and make it visible now. Something like that. How easy would it be to create a list like this? Well, without a pivot table, you're going to have to use some formulas. And here's the formula I'm using in all of these. I'll just double click one of these. And you can see that. That'll look a little bit better if I slide to the right there and then double click. You'll see the entire formula in one row. Now, a good proficient Excel user is going to take 10, 15 minutes to get this right. Not the easiest thing in the world. It's using a relatively new function as of 2007 called SUMIFS. It works, it's great, and you can see that it's used in all of these cells here. Eventually you'd see that. We've got totals on the right, totals on the bottom. Not the easiest thing to do. And furthermore, as you look at the data again, and we're thinking this out, what if after viewing this for a while, maybe we're at a sales meeting, we're looking at these numbers, what would happen if somebody said, okay, that's good, we've seen these numbers, we've checked out some of the low ones, some of the high ones, could we replace the regions here with our 5 customers or our 5 products? How easy would that be? And your response might be, okay, give me 10, 15 minutes, I'll get back to you, we'll have that for you. And after a while, maybe get a little bit faster at that, but still not easily done. And these formulas are horrendous. It's real easy to make a mistake with those. They're not the greatest thing in the world, although, I mean, they work and that's good. But think of all the different combinations here. Not that they would all be necessary, but still, you want to compare customer and region, customer and product, customer and salesperson, then product and region, and so on and so on and so on. We'd like to be able to create something like this quickly and have that flexibility. Now, without overselling the product, what if I were to tell you that you could create a pivot table with these same numbers as the results in about 5 or 10 seconds without formulas? Well, we're going to be doing that. Now, I will spend longer than that because I need to explain what I'm doing, particularly the first time around, but I think you'll eventually see how quick and easy it will be to create a pivot table of this data. And furthermore, we'll have the luxury of saying once we have created it, not only will it be flexible, we won't have to worry about doing anything with that pivot table that's going to alter or challenge or threaten our original data. It's safe. Often we'll put a pivot table on a separate sheet, but even when it's right next to your data, the pivot table concept is designed to let you work with it without fear of disrupting your source data. Try and remember this number, 8,008. We'll be seeing that soon. Our top performer here is Willie Loman, 1111 for the total there. But let's create a pivot table with these results without formulas and relatively fast. Now, the prerequisite, as always, make sure the data you're working with is in one solid cluster. I don't want to keep saying that too often, but that's the prerequisite also for working with your data smoothly whenever you want to do sorting and filtering and subtotal, those other features that are available on the Data tab. Now, based on the fact that they are on the Data tab, you would think, and I would have thought years ago when they first brought this ribbon menu system up, that the pivot table feature would be on the Data tab as well, but it's not. It's on the Insert tab in the ribbon. Now, as long as you know your data is together, you don't have to constantly re-highlight it every time. We can simply, with the active cell anywhere within our data, go to this feature called Pivot Table. A bit later, I'll show you how you could use the recommended pivot tables options to get a slightly faster start there. So I'm going to click Pivot Table. Anytime the Pivot Table dialog box comes up, the Create Pivot Table is the actual heading of it. Give it a quick look here just to make sure that it's picking up all your data. This says I see all the data from A3 down to G912. Usually a quick look and you move on. Half the time you trust it, you hardly look at it. If we go with the default settings here, we are on the path to creating a pivot table in a separate worksheet, and that's just fine. We'll simply click OK. Watch the bottom of the screen. We're about to see a new sheet in this workbook. It's called Sheet 1. And off to the left, we've got a pivot table placeholder. I'll zoom in a bit, holding down the Control key and the mouse wheel. Now, on the right side of the screen, you will see pivot table fields. This is a dialog box. Now, it could be floating, or it might be, as we say, sometimes docked or anchored. If you double-click its title bar, as I'm doing right now, click, click, it appears this way. It's possible that that's the way it appeared when you come here. It's possible it could be floating. You can always change your mind. If you want it to be floating, I'll drag it out here. If you haven't used the feature yet, you might not have a rationale for preferring one over the other. I tend to prefer it floating, but that might just be my choice. This becomes increasingly important as we work with pivot tables. What we see here are those very field names that we saw before: salesperson, product, region, etc. Now, a couple of clicks and a drag, and we'll have our pivot table. I'm going to check the box for salesperson. Watch the left side of the screen. That's a unique and alphabetized list of our salespersons. At the same time, below, in the lower portion of this pivot table fields dialog box, we see an area here called rows, and that's where we see salesperson. Now, on the pivot table itself, off to the left, that says row labels, and we can see what's happening there, salesperson. In a bit, we'll show you the value of this lower portion. Ultimately, this will be like a map of your pivot table. I'm next going to click the box for items. Now, that's a numeric field, so it will automatically appear in what's called the values area. We see it here in our pivot table fields list, but perhaps more important, we see it over here to the left. There's Willie Loman with that 111 total. Here's that 8,008 total that I mentioned also. The third thing I'm going to do is a little different. I'm going to drag the word region from the pivot table field list into the area referred to as columns. And there's the pivot table with the same numbers that we saw before. As I click on this number or any number, there's no formula in sight. You see it in the formula bar, just pure numbers. Even out here, we're not seeing any real formulas whatsoever. It's all there. A quick look back on the previous sheet where the source data was, and we don't have to remember all the numbers, but there's a 740 and a 633. Believe me, these numbers are the same back here. So we were able to create this very fast, and it certainly would have been faster had I not been talking to. I think you see that. Now, as you look at this, a couple of things might strike you as being a little unusual, and I think they are too. First of all, if you are working with the data by yourself, you're the analyst, so to speak, you're looking at the numbers, oh, interesting, not interesting, whatever. The terms row labels and column labels are certainly not in the way. But on the other hand, if you're ready to print this, or if you're going to be using this in a presentation, this terminology is sort of like what we sometimes call inside baseball. Does your audience care about this? Does it make any difference? Probably not. It's not going to hurt. But if it's you working with the data, why not leave them here? Over time, you want to become familiar with these terms because they do more or less match up. They're not the exact words, of course, but they do more or less match up with the lower portion of this pivot table fields list. And the more we look at the lower portion of this, the more we realize that it is somewhat of a map of the pivot table. And that becomes more important as we start to manipulate these fields. First of all, if you don't want to see these, you've got a couple of options. Now, some of you might already have recognized that our ribbon menu system has been augmented by essentially a new ribbon called Pivot Table Tools. And there are two contextual tabs here. One's called Analyze, and one is called Design. In Excel 2010 and 2007, by the way, the Analyze tab was referred to as the Options tab. So a slight change there. Also a different button or two here and there, but for the most part the same. These two tabs are activated whenever the active cell is within the pivot table. If I click outside the pivot table, I'm about to click on cell G2, those two tabs will disappear, and also the pivot table fields list to the right will disappear. So as long as the active cell is outside the pivot table, we're not seeing those pivot table features. And And sometimes if you're relatively new with this, you kind of forget that, and you're sort of in panic mode, and say, well, where's my field list? Where are those buttons? Click back within the pivot table, and they return. If you don't want to see the terms column labels and row labels, one option is on the Analyze tab in the ribbon, the rightmost button, you can simply get rid of field headers. Now, those were not replaced by any other labels, but many, many times, for example, here you could say, well, do we really have to say to people those are salespersons? Well, of course they're salespersons. We don't need a heading there. Do we have to say those are our regions? Maybe not. So sometimes you might just say that's fine. We don't need to see anything. Now, let's leave them there. I'm going to go back and resurrect them. I think a better approach is to go to the Design tab in the ribbon. Now, in no way is this intuitive. It's certainly not difficult, but when we go to the Design tab, we can click the button third from the left, Report Layout. And there are three choices, and you wouldn't know, and you wouldn't even know why, but right now we are viewing so-called compact form. And that usually doesn't have much meaning until we've got multiple fields, more involved than we do now. Say multiple fields in the rows area and so on. If you choose outline or tabular, either one of these, you will see the actual field names. I think that's what most people would want. I think one of these should be the default. The major difference in these two is that outline does not show grid lines, tabular does. So here's tabular form. We see the layout that way. I think what most people would prefer, see salesperson here, region here. Those are the field names. We see them in our list to the right, and we see them right here. That would make sense. The other option there under design, report layout right here, is outline. We'll see the same layout, but no grid lines. It's just a question of what you prefer. And you can change your mind at any time, of course. Now, standard Excel features are in play here. So for example, if you say, I want the rows to, so for example, if you say, I want the columns to be narrower, click in the upper left corner, double click a boundary between any two column letters and the row widths, or the column, or the double click that boundary between any two columns, and the column widths are optimum width. And you can manually move these around too if you wish, and so on, as you choose. And of course, you could right align these. Again, standard Excel features are all going to be there too, that way. Okay, so let's say it's relatively easy to create. I think most of the time when you create these, you'd probably want to make the label switch to get these in place. Imagine if this were, as I had suggested earlier, maybe a sales meeting and everybody's looking at the numbers, and maybe the discussion about this has pretty much run its course, and somebody already maybe has brought up this idea. Could we see, for example, instead of the regions right here, could we see the product instead, the products we've been selling? Remember in that earlier example, working off of formulas, okay, it's going to take 10 minutes. We'll get back to you later. What do we do here? I'm going to uncheck the box for region in the pivot table fields list. Product is a text field. If I simply check its box, it will appear as a rows label. I'm going to do this the first time, not because I want to, but because you might do it sometime, and sometimes you might even want this view. So I'm going to check the box for product. Because it's a text field, it will automatically appear in the rows area, and then watch the pivot table as well. Now, I wouldn't say that's a horrible display, but let's say that's not exactly compact. And although nobody necessarily defines a pivot table as being something compact, many, many times the idea is we want a quick look, we want a compact view of what's going on. So what I could have done, and what I will do now, is drag product into the columns area off to the right here. And that's the kind of list that we probably would have wanted. I think most people would prefer this style. Once again, a quick readjustment of the column widths, click in the upper left corner, double click any column boundary between letters. And of course, the columns are going to be different width because of the words here and so on. But nevertheless, we've got some tools available to us there. What some people might do, and I'm not a huge fan of this, but nevertheless, it could look okay. We could drag across these, and then on the Home tab in the ribbon, we could use the angle counterclockwise option right there, and then readjust our column widths again. There we go. So you could make a case for that possibly if you found it difficult, or make them vertical too is another option if you wanted to. If you're trying to pack more onto the screen, and sometimes that does make sense. I wouldn't say it always does. By the way, vertical text is not a great choice, but rotate text up would be a sensible option right here. And then we can do this. So that's an alternate way of displaying these. So, but let me undo that, because that is a little unusual. Nothing just wrong, but it's a little bit unusual. So there we are. And as you might imagine, if this were a sales meeting and we're looking for certain numbers, and possibly the sales manager has done this manually ahead of time and knows what he or she is looking for, you know, maybe the low number jumps out, the high number jumps out, but we're reviewing the data at hand. And somebody else says, could we do this by customer? Sure we can. You can also remove a field from the grid here simply by dragging it off. I think unchecking the box is going to be faster, but nevertheless, here's product. I'll just drag it off of the pivot table fields list this way, and then come up here and drag customer into the columns area. Looks like that. So now we're seeing it by customer. And once again, maybe a readjustment of the column widths and so on. See what's happening there. Now, at different times, you'll decide to compare different fields, and we're not going to count all the options here, but you can imagine with salesperson, product, region, customer, all the different combinations here that we might see. I'm going to uncheck the box for salesperson and check the box for region. Since that is a text field, it will automatically appear as a rows label. Now, as we look at this, I think a lot of people almost immediately might say, well, okay, that's all right, but could we get the region names across the top and then the customers down the side? Now, even though these are called pivot tables, most of the time we hardly use the word, but the word pivot derives from this concept. We've got data looking like this. Could we pivot this from the upper left-hand corner so that our customer names were down in column A and the regions across the top? Well, we can do that. And pivoting isn't really a single action, and a lot of times you don't even hear the word being used. So the concept, even though it's the source of the name of this feature, a lot of times we sort of overlook. What we'd like to do to pivot here is simply switch the two field locations of customer and region. So it's no particular single action, it's usually just switching locations, and in no particular order. So I'm going to drag customer from the columns area into the rows area, and then drag region from the rows area into columns. And there it is, and maybe a readjustment of the column widths again and so on. So we can easily make those choices as we do this. And once again, think of how you're using this. If it's you as the analyst, you've got some instincts perhaps about this data, you've been working with it for a while maybe, and if you pardon the pun, you bring your strengths to the table as we look at the data here. You have an instinct perhaps, or a thought as to how these interrelationships are important or not so important. Based on what we've seen so far, you might also make the assumption that we compare two major fields, columns and rows. But you saw an interim view there. In fact, I can bring region back here under rows now. It's possible to have two fields in the same area. Now, that's not necessarily the best display, but what if somebody said, could you leave that there for the moment and then see this breakout by product? So we've got two fields in the rows area. I'm going to drag product into the columns area and maybe zoom back a little bit. Now, that might not be your idea of a pivot table, but it is a pivot table. And on the printed page, only 30 rows of data, that's not overwhelming. Maybe in a presentation, it might be a bit much. And sometimes you do think about that. Are you preparing this table for yourself, for some other analysts? You're going to print it and send it to them. Would it be appropriate in a live presentation to be showing this many numbers? Maybe, maybe not. As you look at the data too, you might or might not be seeing subtotals. So you can go to the design view in the ribbon, go to subtotals, do not show subtotals. You might consider doing that. We could switch our report layout to be tabular. If you want to see grid lines, we could consider doing that. And as you look at the data, again, be thinking, is this too much to be displaying? Is it too little? You're the judge. And we can move these fields around in different combinations. Now, would it be better if we put the relative locations of product and region? What if we flip those in their opposite locations? Let's see what it looks like. If we drag region from the rows area into the columns area, I think you'd recognize here, that's likely to be too wide for most people's taste. Even if we readjust the column widths here, it's still going to be a bit of a, we see what's happening there. We can see it all on the screen, but that's a bit tight. Anytime you've got multiple fields, more likely than often, it's going to be better if you have more fields in the rows area as opposed to the columns area. So we could put product as a rows label this way. Now, that takes up more horizontal space or less horizontal space. We can see what's going on here. And by the way, backtracking just momentarily, and this is not my favorite view, but we recognize if we go back to the Design tab, Report Layout, the so-called compact form will collapse this horizontally. It will not be as wide, but it will bring back those terms, row labels and column labels, which I don't think most people want to see. Nevertheless, here's what compact form looks like. So you could make a case for that. Maybe just take these off if you wanted to. Could go back to Analyze, hit that right button, and so on. So we've got different options here available for displaying this in ways that make sense to you. And keep in mind too, there will be times when you're dragging fields to different locations, you might say, wow, that looks ugly, or I don't like the look of that. You can certainly drag fields back, but do remember that Control-Z, which means undo, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, you can easily use that. I'm going to press Control-Z once, twice, 3 times, maybe 4 times, 5 times, so on. So you can certainly use that in different ways. If you perhaps have undone more steps than you want to undo, you can redo with Control-Y. And sometimes you might be saying, okay, there's that view, here's Control-Z, here's Control-Y. You can go back and forth. Now, obviously you don't want to be doing that too much, but at certain times, if you're trying to assess 2 different displays that were performed in an adjacent manner, you can go back and revisit them and go back and forth a little bit. There will be times when certain layouts just don't work for you and you move on. And remember, sometimes you have a certain instinct about what it is you're trying to display here. So the focus sometimes is getting just that right layout that looks good for you. And of course, if you are rehearsing, so to speak, for a presentation, you're going to have figured out probably ahead of time which display is best, or maybe you, in the nice way, have what's the good equivalent of, I've got an axe to grind. If there's something you're dead set on proving, and you've seen the right numbers, that's the particular layout that you're most interested in. So we've got a lot of flexibility here, and we're not worried about in any way disrupting our original data. It's not just because this is on a separate sheet. Pivot table concept itself is designed not to let you accidentally disrupt your source data. It's not going to happen. A lot of flexibility here. There is maybe for a while a little bit of uncertainty. You want to quickly get over the idea that if you put a field in the wrong place that it's a disaster. Just undo it, move on, try something different. And many of these displays are, you might say, well, it's not what I was looking for. Well, fine, move on. Don't think of it as a negative. You've got a lot of power at your fingertips here to display this information. Now, we might come back to this particular worksheet here, but I want to move on to a different kind of data, just to emphasize or to bring out the idea that we can work with pivot tables regardless of the kind of data we're looking at. Here's a different collection of data here. I'll double click the bottom edge of the active cell just to give you a quick look. This goes down to row 742. So imagine this is a company, it's headquartered in a certain, we don't know where it is necessarily. They're in a campus-like setting, so they're in different buildings. People are in different departments. We see their statuses, birth dates, hire dates, years of service, that's a calculation, how much money we're paying them, and whether they have benefits or not. The difference between this data and the other data, in addition to its style of content, is, for example, in column I, there are empty cells, and nothing wrong with that. Now, one person looking at this might say, what I'd really like to see in a pivot table is, could we make some kind of a correlation, or is there a correlation maybe between years of service and job rating? Could be. Is there any correlation between compensation and rating? Maybe. Someone else might say, Could we get a quick list of what each department is spending for compensation? We sure could. Could we have that broken out by status? Yes, we could do that too. Another person might say, is there a correlation between age and job rating? And you want to be careful with that one. Well, there could be. So different people view data differently. Let's say in looking at this, you might want to do what I had suggested. One of the suggestions I made was, could we somehow come up with a list here that shows this data broken out by department, by status, and show the compensation. In other words, how are these departments spending money on human resources here? Now, we can put the pivot table on the same worksheet as the data. That's not necessarily a negative or a positive. You'll be the judge of that. The default location is a separate sheet, as if to say it's going to be a large enough entity you might want to work with it all by itself. But you've got the option, and we'll show you how to do that right now. Let's say that we want to create a pivot table starting over in column L. And I'll show you, by the way, some things that we might do with our data that you would think could disrupt the pivot table, but won't. So we've got our data in shape, and once again, we would have gone through the data to make sure we have no empty rows. And if you work with the data frequently, that's not something you have to do that often. Once again, you might press Control A. You could press Control period a few times just to see. Our data goes down to row 742, nothing below that, that's it. Control period, we're back up top. Okay, click on a single cell, Insert tab, Pivot table, give it a quick look, it's got it right again. This time, though, we'll make a change. Choose where you want the pivot table report to be placed, not on a new worksheet this time. How about existing worksheet? Click on the location panel, click on cell L1. There we are, and OK. We'll scroll off to the right. There's our pivot table field list. By the way, when this is floating, you have the option of making it narrower, making it shorter if you wish. No real strong rationale for doing that, but sometimes maybe you want a little bit smaller. Now, I want to show department and status. What if I drag department into the columns area? I think almost immediately you would see that's probably not going to be the best place. Now, it's something you pick up on pretty early when you work with pivot tables. If a field has lots of variation in it, and there are about 20-25 departments here, usually the columns area is not the best place. Now, you don't always know that ahead of time, but had I simply clicked the box for department, and let me, I'll just drag it off of here for the moment. If I simply click the box for department, it will automatically appear as a rows label. And I think you'd agree, it's going to be the better place here for sure. Now, something you should always do is check through the list. This is an alphabetized list. And occasionally, you want to be on the lookout for duplicates, or maybe more correctly stated, unintended duplicates. Did anybody misspell environmental? That would never happen, would it? Well, if it did, we'd have a double entry here for environmental health and safety, or maybe a triple entry, depending upon how it was misspelled. Now, here's something else that you might see. Here's project and contract services. Now, here it is down here with the word and. Here it is with the ampersand. Now, this is alphabetized, but why did this one end up down here? Not because it's a duplicate. It has, for maybe an obscure reason. If you are familiar with custom lists, those are lists that you can create and use. If any of those are built in, they might be used as the order that's intended here. So that's why this might appear at the bottom here. But we've got a potential problem here, and we are going to deal with it, although not yet. But always check through the list. Think of it as, if the data is correct, this is a unique alphabetized list of all variations. And I wouldn't say you use a pivot table to create a list like that, but you certainly could. Now, the other two fields we want to show are the compensation field. I'm going to check the box for compensation. Because that's a numeric field, it will automatically appear in the values area. And on the pivot table, it's going to appear in column M. And there it is. Let's break this out by status. I think you sense ahead of time this is likely to be better as a columns area field, a columns label field, or columns area, either way. There it is. All right, a sea of numbers. We want to be careful with those, but nevertheless we've got them. Two major things to deal with here. The number display, totally unacceptable for presentation and for the printed page. If you printed this without adjusting the numbers, people would think you were not crazy, you just weren't tuned into what's going on these days. You just can't display large numbers like that. Let's deal with what we dealt with the last time right off the bat. Row labels and column labels, I think most people would not want to see them. We go to the Design tab in the ribbon. Third button from the left, Report Layout. Show in tabular or outline, either one. There we go. Now, to deal with the numbers, right-click on any of the cells in the numbers area here. That means any of these. You'd probably do it on a cell that has numbers, sure, but anyone will work. Right-click any one of them. You can go right to Number Format. In our example here, the key choice is going to be number, no decimals, but certainly commas. There we are right there. Much, much easier to read and much more orthodox and standard. And we can see pretty quickly as we look at our grand total column what's going on, and we can see which departments are spending more money on different kinds of compensation. Now, an alternate to this, and not unique to pivot tables, but something you might want to consider doing here. If you are dealing with numbers in the tens and hundreds of thousands and well into the millions in some cases, you might want to consider displaying numbers in thousands. And if these are large budget numbers in different situations, you might want to even display them in millions. So a not so well-known shortcut, once again, we'll right-click here and go to number format. A not so well-known shortcut, maybe the better way to say it is not really a shortcut, but a different way to display these values is when we come into the Formatting Cells dialog box here, click the panel under Category. Click the entry under Category for Custom right here. Take any one of these, say the current one, and alter it so that it ends in 0.0, comma. Now, who would ever guess or know that the trailing comma means do not show 3 characters to the left of the decimal? In other words, in thousands. So I'll click. What I'll do first of all, by the way, is highlight that and press Control-C so I can display it larger on the screen. Click OK. There we are. Now, that's in thousands, and that could be fine for some audiences. And by the way, that format, I'll just put it out here for the moment, is this. And maybe actually put it up here and make it larger for the moment, just so we can see it better. That's the format being used. The trailing comma means display the number in thousands. If these were larger numbers and we wanted to display them in millions, we put in a second trailing comma. The 0.0 isn't truly necessary, but I think for some people it gives a certain air of authority. Maybe that's easy to read. If you don't like that, we could right-click, come back again to number format, and this time I'll take the existing format and maybe just take out the period 0 but leave in the trailing comma. And now we'll see numbers in thousands this way. So that's 193,000, 1,489,000, 60,000, and so on. Now what we're seeing are rounded versions, so none of these are exact, of course. And we have different display methods available here. And again, these are not unique to pivot tables, these unusual formats like this. I'm going to backtrack a little bit and do display them the way I did the first time, because I think even though that may not be ideal, I think that's what most people would probably do. So I'm going to press Control-Z once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. There we go, back to here. So remember, the 2 major things we did to make this pivot table much more acceptable, we cleaned up the labels here by going to the Design tab, choosing Report Layout, and Outline or Tabular, in this case tabular. And we also right-clicked on one of the numbers, went to Number Format, and chose a format that had commas in it. In this case, it was the Number tab, no decimals, but with the thousands separator. There are a couple of other options we could have chosen too. Since these are various forms of compensation, some people might choose currency. I tend to not do that because it just makes the display denser, but Here's what that would look like. And that certainly could be acceptable in some cases. I'm going to press Control Z though to undo that. So here's a pivot table showing various amounts of compensation. But earlier I did mention this problem that we had. And this is going to bring out an issue about pivot tables that you might not be aware of. We've got a problem here, and it looks like it probably relates to only one record, $13,000 here. And this obviously should be with the other data up here in this row right there. So we can find the problem here and correct it. I'm going to go over to the left here. We're looking for project and contract services. That list is sorted by department, so we can scroll down and find that. Project and contract services. There we are. We're in the neighborhood more or less. And momentarily make the column wider. And there's the defending. And there's the offending item. All we need to do, in this case, is drag down and create this. So that's all cleaned up and taken care of. However, when we go back to the pivot table, you might be a little surprised to see that nothing really has changed. This is still here. Now, think of what happens when you work with charts. If you work with a chart, if you change the source data that's used in the chart reacts immediately. It's all cleaned up. And even early when you were working with Excel in the early days, maybe even on day one of Excel, I think you picked up pretty strongly on the idea that if you've got a formula that refers to different cells, when you change the data in any of those source cells, what does the formula do? It reacts immediately. And so we get used to working with Excel in that way. But with pivot tables, it's a bit different. And here's what happens. And there are a number of underlying reasons we don't need to go into, but when you create a pivot table, what happens is all of your source data is copied to an area referred to as the pivot table cache, C-A-C-H-E. It's in the background. And the pivot table that you create is based on the pivot table cache, which is based on the source data. So when you change the source data, the pivot table cache has not been updated. And probably the rationale for doing that is with some data, you might be heavily going through lots of changes. You don't want to have a big pivot table, have a pause while the pivot table reacts to all that. And so what happens here is when we make changes to our source data, nothing is happening in the pivot table yet until we refresh it. You can use the word update, but the command that we use, the concept is called refresh. It sort of means the same as update, but just so we know the difference there. Now, we don't have to have the active cell here or anywhere down here, but it won't hurt to be looking at it as we make this change. So how do we refresh the pivot table? We can do it two ways. On the Analyze tab, there's the button called Refresh. Get the latest data from the source connected to the active cell. It's also got a keystroke shortcut, Alt F5. So as we look at this, here's what is about to happen. This data here is about to be folded in and combined with this data. So looking at the total out there, the 4,192,000, it's going to go up by 13,000. So that'll take us into what, about 4,206,000, something like that. 4,205,000 maybe, something like that. So 4,205,000 is what we expect that to be. But all we need to do, and the active cell can be anywhere here, we'll simply go to Analyze and Refresh, and there it is. It's happened. And there it is, 4,205,000, and that other row disappeared. Grand total moved up. We're all set. But you got to keep an eye on your source data, and you got to remember that concept. Updating your data doesn't cause an immediate reaction in your pivot table. And if you forget that, you're going to be in the difficult and awkward situation sometimes where you're presenting data that isn't really up to date. Now, there's some other issues associated with this too. Let's bring these out too. What if we add a new record here? First of all, maybe I'm looking at the data here and I've zoomed in somewhat and making some changes, adjusting this, adjusting that. And for the moment, maybe I'm forgetting there's a pivot table over there. I want to add a new record here. So maybe I'll just right click on row 7 and choose Insert. And here's a message. And in its newer folksy style as of 2013, the message says, we can't make this change for the selected cells because it will affect a pivot table, and on and on and on. So we can't do that. In other words, by mistake here, we could not insert a row because off to the right, there's a pivot table. It would disrupt it. But we certainly could, if we wanted to, highlight just these cells here, right-click and insert, and this time shift the cells down. Click OK. If we did put in new information here, that does not automatically update the pivot table, but once we put the information in, we'd click within the pivot table and do the refresh, and we'd be all set. So I'm not going to do that, so I'll press Control Z. But here's another option. A lot of people, myself included, many times will add new records at the bottom of the list and then sort the data. So what if I put in 5 new records down here? I could do that. I'm not going to do the typing right now, but imagine if I put in 5 new records. Because they're at the bottom of the list, after having done that, if I click within the pivot table and refresh, what happens? Nothing. Nothing happens. If I really did add those and I wanted them to be included in the pivot table, here's what I'd have to do. Go back to the Analyze tab in the ribbon and change the data source. Right there. And then, instead of this list going down to row 742, if I had added 5 records, I'd change that to be 747 and then click OK. And that would update the list. And then our pivot table would be in shape. So that can get a little cumbersome. Now, here's an alternate way, and I don't want to go too far with this, but as of 2007, there's a new feature called a table. If you had taken, and it's too bad we're using the word table in a different sense than pivot table, but some of you may be familiar with this idea. When you have a list of data, this new feature called a table allows you, if you convert this data to a table, you will be able to see some visual changes and also have some additional features associated with it that make you work with that data as an entity. Makes it easier to work with the data that way. Now, I made a copy of this earlier and converted it into a table. It looks like this. Now, when you first convert data to a table, the obvious difference is the look of it. And furthermore, it gives you a design tab here. These are called banded rows. You could turn those off and choose banded columns instead. It just makes working with the data a little easier as we scroll up and down. Something else you might have noticed. Look what happens when I scroll up and down. Watch the column letters disappear, and they are being replaced by the field names, the column headings. Interesting. Those are ultimately more important than the column letters anyway. What else do we get with this table feature? Any column we add to the right automatically becomes part of the table. Any row we add at the bottom becomes part of the table. So what if this were the source for our pivot table? As soon as we add a row here, it's part of the source data automatically. Now we still would have to do a refresh. But let's go back to restate what I did with the other data. If I add 5 new records here, they become part of the table automatically. A simple refresh of the pivot table will pick up these records. That's it. And we can press Alt F5. So if we had done that, fine. In other words, if our source for the pivot table is one of these tables, all we need to do, as soon as we add the records, is a simple refresh. So if that had been the case with this pivot table here, if this had been a regular table and it was the source for a pivot table over here, we'd add the records. We would not have to go back to, as I did earlier, change the data source. We don't have to do that. So there is an advantage of working with table. For the most part, I don't think any real major disadvantages, other than that you cannot use subtotals with these. But you might want to look into that feature. It's got some merit to it. It enhances the idea that your data is an entity and it's going to be treated as an identity. Let me rephrase that. It's going to be treated as an entity. And notice here too that it automatically activates filter arrows. There's also, and we'll bring this out in the second portion of this course, but there's also a new feature called slicers, introduced in Excel 2010. And in Excel 2010, they were only available with pivot tables, but as of Excel 2013, they will be available with tables like this as well. And without having seen that, you won't know how good that is. But we'll see that in the next session of this course. So let's go back to the data we were working with. And bring out another idea, something we haven't yet done. And that's the idea that sometimes when you work with data, you might want to consider having two fields in the values area. Now, don't think of it necessarily expressed that way, but what if you were looking at the data here and someone said, could we somehow get a count of how many people work in each of these departments? Well, we can do that. And somebody else immediately says, well, could we show that as well as the salaries, the compensation amounts here? Yes, we can do that too. So which field would we use in the values area here to count the number of employees? As it turns out, actually, we could use a couple of different ones, but employee name is the one that would make sense. Now, that's a text field, though. I could put it in the rows area here. It's going to make for a pretty busy pivot table, and it possibly has merit, though. It could be printed. That could be a good bit of information. I certainly wouldn't use it in presentation or suggest it's good there, but we see it here. But what if we drag employee name into the values area? Now remember, that's a text field. All the examples we've seen so far, and most of the time what you see in the values area are numerical fields, but this is a text field. And immediately we see the phrase count of employee name. So here's this pivot table now. I'm going to zoom back a little bit. And I have to say, and I think most people might agree, that's not a very attractive layout. We can do some things with it, though, to make it better. We might have to scroll back and forth if we were trying to show these. Let me zoom in a little bit on just the upper left corner for a bit. And by the way, you can zoom in and out quickly and easily with the control key and the mouse wheel. Makes no difference where the mouse is pointing. Okay, first of all, let's take a look at some of these headings. That's awfully unwieldy, and we see it 3 other times to the right, too. We can easily change that. It almost sounds like some sort of a strange medieval title. The count of employee names or something. Let's just change that. Call it head count. Why not? Now, not only does this appear to be changing right here, it will also change over in column P and also in column R and one other column out there. So I'll simply press enter. That's going to help a bit. It'll click in the upper left corner, double click the column boundary between any 2 letters, tightens it up a bit. Same thing here, sum of compensation. Now, if you use the abbreviation comp a lot, and that's something in your area that people are familiar with, why not just say comp total here, or total comp, whatever. I'll put in comp total. Enter. And all those relative fields are being changed too. So at least we can tighten this up a little bit this way. And let me zoom back a little bit. Possibly, could we use the compact form here? I don't think that's going to help, but at least maybe a look at that might indicate something. That usually is more about compacting fields in the rows area, but let's see if that's going to make a difference here. Design tab, report layout, compact form. Didn't really help there. Let's go back. I'll just press Control Z to undo that. There we go. But there's still something we could use here. Now, I could make the case. I think some people could say that's not so bad. We see here we are for full time. That's what we're paying. That's the comp amount. Here's the head count. Here's the 2 half-time columns. Here are the 2 hourly columns, and so on. So some merit could be made for this display. We're showing 2 kinds of data at the same time. Here too, a handout on the printed page to accompany the display might be appropriate here. It's not that deep, it's fairly wide, a lot to absorb. But recognize something else, and I didn't point this out when I moved the employee name field into values. After changing the name of it to head count here, right within the pivot table, it also changed here in the values area. It says head count now. That's nice because it corresponds with the heading that we have. At the time I did that, and when I brought it in as employee name, what also appeared here is this entry right here. It says sigma or sum of values. and right above it, it says status. I'm going to drag the word status below values, and we see what's happening there. And now I think that looks even better. What we've done now is we've put together in one cluster the compensation amounts, and then over here in a separate cluster, the head counts. Let's readjust the column widths again, get that a little tighter maybe. Remember, we could use the angled text. We could do that if we wanted to, but I think that's an even better display. And one more thing we could consider, it's just a question of preference. Would you prefer to have the head count columns here to the left of the compensation amounts? If you do, then in the values area of this pivot table fields list, we're going to drag comp total and put it below head count. Watch the display. We simply move the columns left and right there. There we are, that way. So it's just a question of, is this a usable, workable pivot table? I think it is. On the other hand, you do have to kind of think at different times about the display of numbers and whether it's too overwhelming at times. Here's another thought though. What if you said, or what if from the beginning here we had said, could we have created a second pivot table? A second pivot table here. Well, we could have done that. And we can do it right now too. I'm going to zoom back and simply duplicate this pivot table. Now, to make it a little bit simpler and a little bit easier to view, what I'm going to do here is actually take out the head count momentarily. I'll just uncheck the box for employee name. So how do we make a copy of a pivot table? Well, we could highlight the cells and do a copy paste. That's one way. If it's super large and we didn't want to highlight it, we could go to Analyze in the ribbon and select entire pivot table. We could do that. Or we could click within it and press Control A and then copy paste it. So different ways. In all cases, after selecting it, we're going to copy it. So how about Control C? I'm going to click right here in cell S1 and press Control V. Now, we'd adjust the column widths eventually too. Two pivot tables for the moment identical. In this pivot table to the right, what I'm going to do here is change it from compensation to be employee name. So I'll uncheck the box for compensation and drag in employee name again. And immediately change that phrase, count of employee name, I'll change it to head count. Now, is this approach better than having both sets of data within the same pivot table? I could agree with you if you said that. I could also agree with the other display too. I think it's a wash maybe. Just a question of how you prefer to work with the data. Now do keep in mind, you can create other pivot tables too off existing pivot tables, all working off the same source data. So here's another thought. The building site manager is in your audience here and saying, could we see a head count here based not on status, but by building? I'd like to know, do these different departments, I know some of them have their people spread across different buildings in our campus-like setting here, but could we show building here instead of hour? Could we show building here instead of status? Let's uncheck the box for status and bring in, now let me backtrack. I made a slight mistake there, but that's okay. I'm going to press Control Z. The active cell was in the pivot table to the left. I want to make a change in the pivot table to the right, so I'll click within that pivot table. There we are. And I'm going to uncheck the box for status. And now this pivot table, the one closest to our dialog box, is going to not have status in it. And then I'm going to drag building into the columns area. A quick readjust of the column widths here. Now, the building site manager is probably screaming right now as he or she is recognizing that it looks like every department here has its people scattered all over the place. Now, maybe that was known ahead of time, but this really brings it out. Nevertheless, it's what you're looking at, and this pivot table, you might say for the moment, has nothing to do with the other one. Different kinds of data. We're using one of the fields that's the same, but there's nothing required there. We could use other fields in this pivot table, other fields in the one to the left, and we could have another pivot table if we wanted to. If we try and do something with one of the pivot tables that would cause it to run into the other one, Excel just blocks us. So suppose in this pivot table to the left here, and working off of our pivot tables field list, suppose I try and put another field in the columns area, maybe years of service. And you know that's not going to work because it's going to create at least, how many columns? Many, many actually. What's going to happen if we try and put years into the columns area? Immediately pop up dialog box. A pivot table report cannot overlap another pivot table report. So we see what's happened there. Can't do that. So you will not run into too many problems here with this. Now, a couple of other things we want to do with this before we move on to different issues here. In the pivot table to the left, let's say, as we're looking with the data, let's just focus on it for the moment. And what I'll do temporarily is make the column between the two much wider, so just more or less shove the other pivot table out of view for the moment. So we're looking at this data, and somebody says, could we put this list in descending order by grand total? It sure would be easier to read. We can focus more on the numbers. Now, what we do not have to do is highlight all of these cells. We don't have to do that. But I'm doing it for the moment just to suggest what it is we would want to sort. And actually, let me correct this just a little bit here. We do not want to sort our grand total row. Let's say we wanted to move these rows up and down. We do not have to highlight the data. All we need to do is to click out here in column Q. And then on the data tab in the ribbon, we can simply click the button ZA. Remember, we only need to click one cell in column Q here. Click the ZA button, and what happened? All these cells here got sorted to be moved up or down based on the row they were in. So the row integrity is intact. For any given set of data across here, it simply got moved up or down. And we can see readily not only which department is spending the most money, but also who's second and third and so on. We might want to relate that to headcount, we might not. We've got different categories here, so it might be a little tricky. But the point is we have the ability to do this easily and quickly without highlighting the data. And there's no question you want to do something like this. Another person might say, well, I just want to focus more on the full-time people. Could we sort this list descending order by full-time? For example, this number actually is bigger than that one, and that's going to happen again down here. And we got some empty ones and so on. So let's reorder the entire list based on what's here. And all we got to do is click somewhere here, click our ZA button again on the data tab here. And now we've moved our rows up and down so that whatever was in column M determines the placement here. And we see what's going on. One of those departments, the ADC department, doesn't have any full-time employees, and therefore that's empty. And we see some other gaps there too. Certain kinds of categories don't exist for certain departments. So it's really easy to sort the data. And if at a later time somebody says, could we alphabetize this? Sure we can. And not by doing undo, because we might have done other things in the meantime. We'll simply click here in column L, press AZ, there it is. So we've reordered it alphabetically this way. And there's something else we can do with this too that might surprise you. As we look at the totals on the bottom, we can see full-time is the biggest. We would have expected that probably. Contract is second. And even though we can probably see these and wouldn't necessarily need to do this, what if, thinking of this data, we could move those columns left and right from high to low? In other words, why not see full-time first, and then contract, and then half-time, and then hourly? Well, once again, we do not have to highlight all the data this way. We simply click in this example on one of these cells down here, one of these. And all we need to do is to press the ZA button if we want these columns to be in order left to right in descending order. There's ZA right there. Click it, and we see what's happened. So the contract column, which had been over in column P, has now been moved over here. Let's see what's happened. If for some reason, I don't think you'd want to do this, but if you wanted to reverse the order and make the highest field be over here, all we need to do is click on one of these, and we'll do an AZ sort. And you see what's happened. In ascending order from left to right, we see these numbers. Believe me, and you can check it out for sure, the numbers are staying in their appropriate locations associated with the appropriate row entry and column entry. So we could do some undos to go back to the way we wanted this to be, or possibly just sort it again. Click down here. I think descending order would be preferable. We'll click ZA. So it's back to that order. Something else we might consider doing here, and I want to bring out again this idea that when we make changes to our data, we have to be thinking of our pivot tables. Now, what I'd like to do, at least momentarily, is hide some of this data right here, because I want to bring that other field, I want to bring that other pivot table over to the left. Now I could drag it over possibly, but this might be a little bit more direct. I'm going to hide these columns so that we're looking at this data here, a quick readjustment of the column widths, make it a little bit easier to read. And furthermore, I want to, oops, after hiding this, right-click hide. What I'd like to do is change the display here and go back to status again. So I'll uncheck the box for building and bring in status as a columns field, and then readjust these column widths just briefly. Imagine, real life scenario here, 2 of our people in the ADC department have been offered full-time positions and they've accepted. So what I'm going to do, once again, so we can see things more clearly, I'll hide some of the intervening columns. There we are. So this is our source data, and some hidden columns are to the right of it. This is one of our 2 pivot tables. This pivot table is based on this source data, but remember, in the background, we've got our pivot table cache. So in a stricter way, let's say, our pivot table here is based on the pivot table cache, which is based on our source data. So David Mercado here and Eric Pratt have been offered full-time positions. They've both accepted. I'm going to change these entries to be full-time. And based on what I've said, I think you know here, although we change our data here, what's happened in the pivot table? Nothing. For this ADC department, how many full-time people do we have? None. 3 contract people? Well, looks like we have only 1. I just changed these 2. And you know what needs to be done here? We need to refresh the pivot table. I could press Alt F5 as we keep an eye on this. We're about to see the number 2 right there, and the number 3 over here will become a 1. Active cell can be anywhere within the pivot table. Maybe there. I'll press Alt F5. Our pivot table has been updated. Now we see a 2 here, and there's only 1 contract person left in the ADC group. We see that right there. Got to keep on top of that concept. Got to remember at all times, updating your source data does not change the pivot table. You've got to do the refresh. Alt F5 is real handy, of course, too. Now, another feature, this could be an attention getter depending upon either your sense of theatricality or when the issue comes up. But suppose there's a meeting here of HR professionals. We've been looking at the numbers, we've been looking at the compensation amounts, we're trying to make some assessments about where the company's heading in terms of hiring and firing and HR and so on. And one of our people in the audience has been working closely with the engineering maintenance people and says, gosh, the engineering maintenance department, they've got 19 contract people. That's interesting. Who are they? And maybe it's just a kind of an idle question. And you're the presenter, and maybe without skipping a beat, and you don't even say what you're doing. You say, gee, I'm glad you asked that, Bob. Double click. I just did a double click. Here are those people. Jeez. Oh, yeah, I know Todd. I know Norm out here and so on. What happened here? Where are we? What's going on? We're on a new sheet to the left of the pivot table. If you double click on any one of these numbers, in effect, what you are saying is, let's go back to the source data and copy those 19 records, or those 7 records, or these 38, or those 151. Make a copy of the source data relevant to that number and paste it on a new sheet to the left of the pivot table and display it in table format. Here are those 19 people. There they are. It's like we made an extract from the source data simply by double clicking. If you did this in the lower right hand corner, you'd be in effect recreating the entire list. Now, I think you can see how, and we're not trying to impress people necessarily, but I think you can see, hey, that's an attention getter. But the real reason, though, is you're interested. You wanted to see that information, and you see it immediately just by double clicking. Now, if you're going to start doing this for more than a few times, of course, you will want to relabel the sheet names. And of course, you do have to keep on top of the idea that if you make changes to the source data, what happens when you refresh the pivot table? The pivot table gets refreshed, but any of these sheets that you had created earlier are not going to be refreshed. The feature, by the way, is referred to as drill down. Drill down. We're drilling back down into the data. Now, but you do have to be remembering that if you do this, any sheets that you create are not going to be up to date all the time. You're going to have to recreate them if you need them. I think a lot of times you don't need them for long. You could, of course, but it's a quick, effective way of going back to the source data when you need to see details about that. Now, in a more impressive situation, maybe, either you, the analyst, or someone in your audience really does need to see this, not just curiosity, but we've got to track this down. Maybe one of these numbers is unusually high. We don't have them broken out by percentages, but for some of these organizations, maybe you're trying to cut back on contract employees. They might have higher compensation amounts, and maybe you're thinking that percentage-wise, there's just too many in this department or that department, something like that. So you've got your reasons for doing this. Maybe this 31 number is high down here for quality control. So are some of these people, and I hate to say it this way, but are some of these people expendable? Do we need all these people here? Who are these 31 people in quality control? Double click, there they are, and so on. Let's review who these people are, how many years they've been here, and so on, how much we're paying them. See what's happening here. So the feature's called drill down. It can be effective at different times, but it does give us some insight into the source data. So as we work with the data here, again, think of how different people are assessing the information. They're trying to figure out what's going on. And as we work with this data, we have increasing confidence that nothing we do is going to disrupt our source data. This pivot table is based on the pivot table cache in the background. And there are just amazing things we can do in terms of analysis. Let's go to a different worksheet, more like the first one perhaps. Sales by category. In this list here, I'll zoom in on it. Here's a company that sells clothing. We've categorized the clothing into major types here. And we've got about 400 rows. I'm going to double click the bottom edge of the cell. By the way, another way to get quickly to the bottom of a column is control down arrow, control up arrow. It will stop when it sees an empty cell. So, a little over 400 rows here. And you can imagine what we might be looking for here. We might want to see a breakout of clothing type by region. We will at some point in the next session of this course, part 2, show you how to deal with information based on date information. We can analyze information by date using pivot tables. That's a strong feature. But let's also point out that sometimes you're not sure what you're looking for, and we can, if we're in a hurry, take advantage of a feature that I had mentioned briefly earlier on the Insert tab. Now, as always, before creating a pivot table, think out, or at least be familiar with your data well enough to know what are we looking at here? It's not in any particular order, at least it doesn't look like it. We're tracking sales by region, by clothing type over a 2-year period, 2012, 2013, by quarter within each year, and by sales type. No empty rows within the data, no empty columns. Let's go to the Insert tab, and this time maybe take a look at recommended pivot tables. And a pop-up tip below us in that folksy style says, want us to recommend pivot tables that summarize your complex data? Click this button to get a customized set of pivot tables that we think will best suit your data. Let's click it. There we are. And we've got some options here. Now, the number of options will vary. When you see one that is exactly what you want, or maybe close enough, the time saver here, and of course as I'm talking about, I'm not really saving much time, but let's say the first one we see here is looking pretty good. Okay, I like this. I can either click this and click OK, or simply double click this. Click it first, and then, it's funny, it seems not to be working. Just click this option and click OK. There we are. And there's a pivot table. So what do we save here? A little bit of time. It does automatically go to a separate sheet. We've got our pivot table field list to the right. I nearly always zoom in when I see pivot table. Control, mouse wheel. There's our pivot table fields over here. What I really wanted was to see region as a column label, so I'll move it there. And I'll simply click the box for clothing type, make it be a rows area field, like that. And there we are. First two orders of business, as we've been seeing in our other examples, let's get rid of these row labels, column labels, design tab, report layout, outline or tabular. There we go. And let's clean up the numbers. Right click, number format, let's get those commas in there. Category number tends to work best here. No decimals, but certainly commas. There we are. One of the areas in our pivot table fields list that we have not talked about is the filters area. And you might also have noticed in our previous examples, although I said nothing about them, we also see drop arrows here. Here's a drop arrow for clothing type. Now, I hardly would think that most people would need an explanation of this, but nevertheless, recognize that it's there. And imagine, for display reasons and when it's a live presentation, you might say, well, let's not show everything right now. Maybe unselect them all. And maybe we just want to show pants and shirts. Click OK. There we are. Different total. The other total was over 6 million. Now we're 3.3 million. So we see a breakout of the numbers here. Not bad. Okay. An advantage of filter, of course, is we show only what we want to show, and that's good. A disadvantage of it is, do we remember the other three types that we're not seeing? If we know our data well, yeah, we'd remember them. But what if we had 10 clothing types or 15? So filtering is great, but we don't always have a good, clear visual of what is not there. I'm going to come back here, choose this again. How about a select all? Okay. Now, here's some other thoughts. I'm going to bring in another field called sales type. It's a text field. I'm going to click its box. That means it will appear as a rows label. Click sales type. There it is. Let's zoom back a little bit. Now, nothing wrong with subtotals, and here they are. But on the other hand, I think there could be times you say, you know, that's a bit too much. Let's take those out. Design tab in the ribbon. Remember, this is a contextual tab that appears when the active cell is within a pivot table. Leftmost button, subtotals, do not show subtotals. There's the display. Let me press Control Z and then Control Y to remind you of the difference. Control Z with subtotals, press Control Y without. Certainly a cleaner look, but there will be times when you want to see those subtotals. But here's another thought. We didn't bring this out earlier when we had two fields in the rows area, but as we're looking at the pivot table here, recognize from left to right, we see clothing type and sales type. And in the pivot table fields list, we see clothing type on top of sales type. So I think you quickly pick up on the idea. The left to right order that we see in the pivot table corresponds with the top down order that we see in our pivot table fields list. So what if I want to flip that order? What if I want sales type to be over in column A and clothing type in column B? Within the pivot tables fields list here, I'm going to drag clothing type downward and put it below sales type. And now we see this layout. And as I press Control Z and Control Y, I think you can see the difference. Now, neater or less complex isn't always better. But on the other hand, at certain points, you're looking for visual clarity that might help. More important, perhaps, is the idea of, do you want to see a clear retail section and wholesale section, or do you want to see a clear clothing type section? Which is better? And by pressing Control Z and Control Y, possibly you'll go back and forth. Now, you don't want to do that too much, of course, but just remember, anytime you've got a display, you want to consider those options and consider how the data looks. And here too, doing something we had done earlier. If we only want to show pants and shirts, we'll come back here. Here's the drop arrow for clothing type. Unselect them all, choose pants and shirts, click OK. And that's what we're seeing. We could undo that with Control Z. Oh, let me bring it back again with Control Y. And you might have seen already, when the arrow here is being used for filtering, we do see the filter icon. Now it's fairly tiny. We don't see it over here. We're not seeing it up here, but we can use the filtering concept there as well. If we only want to focus on certain regions here, we can click the drop arrow. And let's say for now, our focus is, we'll unselect them all. It's just on our Midwest and Northeast and South regions, not Pacific and Mountain. So there we are. We certainly have control over these at different times to display just what we want. Once again, I'll press undo, Control Z, bring back the data this way. So I've got different aspects of that. We've got this filter areas here also. So what I'm going to do is put clothing type and move it, drag it from its rows area into the filters area. Now, when you put a field in the filters area and do nothing with it, it's equivalent to essentially ignoring it. Now, it does change the look of our pivot table layout because it looks like we've got something above the pivot table, but actually it's part of the pivot table, even though it looks isolated from it or separated with a single row there. But we can use it, and in a slightly different way. Now, earlier we showed how you could use the drop arrow. When this was a field in the rows area, we used a drop arrow. If we only want to look at pants here, we can click pants, click OK, and we see pants. 1.3 million in sales there. Pants. Earlier, we had looked at pants and shirts together. Let's come back and do that again this way. What we do here first is select multiple items. We've got pants checked already. Let's also show shirts. Click OK. I'll readjust the column widths. But there's a little bit of a deficiency here. This says multiple items. Now, when we saw clothing type as a rows field, we saw what was being selected. In other words, we saw the word pants, we saw the word shirts. When you use this in the filters area, like we're doing right now, that says multiple items. Now, granted, in a live presentation, the presenter, and probably most of the audience remembers, at least for a bit, what are we looking at here? We're looking at pants and shirts. Now, the presenter certainly would remember that. The audience, it'll elude you for a bit maybe. But we don't know, as we look at this on the screen right now, what's being shown and what's not being shown. So we've got some problems with this. Nevertheless, the filters area can be handy at different times. I'm going to click the drop arrow again, choose all, click OK. And we got this display again. Let's switch the fields again. I'm going to bring clothing type in as a rows field, like this. We saw that earlier. And now move sales type into the filters area. If the field that we have has only 2 entries, like retail and wholesale, I think it's a better candidate because we always have a clear label up there as to what we're seeing. And when we have only a breakout of 2, most people would remember the other one. So we're only looking at retail, that's 4.4 million, or maybe we're only looking at wholesale. That's 1.8 million. And we can bounce back and forth there too with Control Z and Control Y. So we've got some strong capability here in terms of how we use this field here. This actual filters area here. different approaches to the concept. It gives us more working room too. There could be another way to use this. It might sound strange at first. We can use it as kind of a temporary parking area for a field that we don't want to use right now, but we might want to use later. So what I might do here is simply remove sales type. What if we need it later? Well, we have to reactivate it and decide where we want to bring it in. But let's say we bring it in and we're seeing this display. Okay, fine. Somebody in our audience says, can we get rid of the sales type momentarily and just focus on clothing type? So what do we do with sales type? Don't remove it completely from the pivot table fields list in the lower portion. Simply put it into filters. So it's out of the way temporarily. You can bring it back easily and then reconsider these layouts as we look at them. Now, something else we can do here too, and this might surprise you a little bit. We're looking at our field names here. Now, I think most of the time, if you're looking at geographical areas within the United States, more often than not, they're likely to go from east to west, or maybe the reverse, but more likely perhaps east to west. Here's northeast. Now, wouldn't it be better if we could take this data and put it over in column C, and then maybe bump this leftward or something like that? We might want to see from left to right, northeast, midwest, south, Pacific, or actually, what would be best maybe? Northeast, Midwest, South, Mountain, Pacific, something like that. Now, we do not have to highlight all this data. All we need to do is click on the label itself, drag its lower edge. Now, as soon as you see the icon, you'll sense what's happening. The 116,000 and the 52,000 below it, they're going to travel with this. You see the I-beam indicator. I'm dragging it leftward to there. There we go. So I went northeast, midwest. I went south to be the third one from the left. So simply click there, point to its bottom edge, click and drag leftward. That's the order I want to see it in, just like that. So you can do that easily. We can also make changes here in our list over here. It's probably going to be simpler when we only see one field, but I don't think I've tried it on the outer field here, but I'm going to drag dresses and put them below pants. And you saw what happened. So we can move those two up and down as needed. They are alphabetized initially, and you might want to keep them that way, but we have this ability to move these fields around in different ways. Something else you'll notice here too, this is hard to document sometimes, and if there's anything that's awkward about a pivot table, I'd say it's the awkwardness of reading how to do things off the printed page. It might sound a little funny to say, but if you open any good Excel book, and there are lots of good ones, and I'm not putting down the ability of authors to explain things, but there's always something missing when you read about pivot tables. It's that motion idea of moving fields, dragging information that you sometimes don't quite get on the printed page. And some of the terminology just isn't standard. Here's a feature. They used to call this structured selection. I haven't seen the term in years. Haven't seen it around in any of the commands, but if I click on this cell, nothing unusual going on. As I drag leftward, there's a black arrow, which you can probably barely see, but I'm going to click it. And what happens? All the other entries called wholesale are highlighted. Now, if I wanted to, I could go to the Home tab and make those yellow or blue or anything else like that. Makes the data stand out differently. So what happens if I change the relative location of clothing type and sales type? So in the pivot table fields list, I'm going to drag clothing type downward and put it below sales type. So the yellow travels with it. See what's happening there in different ways. If I move this back again, sales type, clothing type, looks like this. Just things you wouldn't exactly expect that help you bring out the data. We could do this in a different way in our field called region. We've got these different entries. Maybe I want Midwest to stand out. Here we see a black arrow, and I'm going to be challenging my ability to work with colors maybe, but maybe I'll make those blue. Now it looks like it's overriding the color there, the yellow, but we'll move clothing type and sales type, change their position at different times. Maybe we'll even make region be a row field and clothing type be a column field. So we see what's happening there. And maybe move sales type out of the mix for the moment, and we'll see the data that way. bring sales type back in, move region out of the way, and so on. There's different ways to display the data. Now, again, you don't want to necessarily be caught doing what I'm doing right now. It sounds like I don't, or it looks as if possibly I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm just pointing out the different ways to display this data. Remember, many, many times, this pivot table is about a presentation. You are about to make a presentation, and you're trying to come up with the best displays, maybe not too much data on the screen. You're trying to bring out this particular unusually high or low number, that idea. So many different reasons for using this. And when you are applying colors like this, I wouldn't say these are the greatest thing imaginable, but you can certainly come back and change these. I'll click right here. If we don't want any color, we'll go back to the Home tab, click the drop arrow, choose No Fill. We could certainly do that. As we bring these fields back in again, we might have other colors out there. I've got them for Midwest. I'll come back. Left side, see the horizontal black arrow, click it, and there too. Come up here, no fill on that. Now, there's another aspect of displaying the data too. And again, think of the dynamism here. For example, for the moment, maybe you just don't want to focus so much on the detail of pants and dresses and shirts. You'd like to collapse the display. Notice that there's a minus to the left of pants. Now you can either click the minus or the plus to collapse when it says minus, that collapses. Plus means, you might say, expand, show me more. There we are. You can also double click. That could be slightly faster maybe. Double click. We don't want to see the detail for dresses. Double click. Nor shirts. Double click. Let's focus on the detail for our belts, ties, and shoes. Different categories. In fact, we could even click on shoes here. Take the lower, drag the lower entry there, drag it up to here. And now we've got the two fields whose detail we want to see side by side. Different ways to display the data. Anytime you've got two or more fields here in the rows area, one of them is a so-called inner field, which you cannot expand and collapse. Others to the left of that are outer fields, and you can expand and collapse them. Double click, or the pluses and minuses you see in front of them. Let's bring back that detail for pants. Double click, detail for dresses, double click, and for shirts, double click, and so on. And if that were not enough, and let me go back with Control Z a couple of times. Keep this display in mind momentarily. Another way to do this would be go to clothing type, click the drop arrow, unselect them all. Let's just select belts, ties, and separate entity, shoes. Let's not show the others. Click OK. So here's one view where we're not seeing any information whatsoever about the three categories called pants and dresses and shirts. We're only focusing on belts, ties. Earlier, we had that same idea, but we did see as single line entries, those fields. So I'll press Control Z, and here we see the three fields down here. Press Control Y, we see them this way. Now, nobody really writes that down or takes notes on that idea, but it's just a reminder of the things you can do when you're looking at these displays, the way you can expand and collapse them. It just gives us enormous presentation capability as we do this. So I'll press Control Z again, undo, go back here. Bring back the detail, double click, oops, right on this field, double click, and down here, double click. We move these around in different ways to display the information in ways that make sense to us. Now, all along with these different pivot tables, what we could have had is a pivot chart. Now, there are times when I think pivot chart is great, but anytime a pivot table crosses a certain uncalculatable threshold, it becomes too busy. Sometimes that's a subjective choice. Now, let me simplify the pivot table for the moment. This isn't a requirement, but it'll make our example a bit stronger here. If we would like to have a chart of this, it might help us display the information better. I think most people know, if they work with charts, even only a little bit, you recognize how, for some people, a chart gets to the matter quickly. Uh, some people will look at these numbers and they just don't sink in. If we've got a chart to the right, it might be very helpful. If this data were not a pivot table, if it were not a pivot table, and you created a chart from here, Excel would pick up all of this data and show it in a chart. And we'd have grand totals and detailed information together. It wouldn't be very desirable. But if we create a chart from a pivot table, and this is a pivot table, of course, Excel will only pick up this data. And I think that's what you would want. So let's click within here. How do we create a pivot chart? Alt F1. There's a chart. It may not be the greatest chart ever, but it does give us a quick visual. And we can, of course, resize it. Notice something else here. Our dialog box to the right that usually, and until now, has said pivot table fields, now says pivot chart fields. And this area right here that in the past we've been seeing as column now says legend series. And in the lower left, instead of seeing rows, we see axis categories. So that might unnerve you or unsettle you at first, but if we think of this as column and this is the rows, that's okay too. So we're looking at our pivot table. What if we change sales type and region? Now we've got a chart on the right, a pivot table on the left. Even though these displays refer to charts, the chart and the pivot table are in sync at all times. So if I bring sales type here, watch the chart and the pivot table, they react immediately. Let's drag region into the legend area, same as columns, we see this. What I think should be the default, but it isn't, it used to be in older versions of Excel. I think many, many times the better chart here is likely to be a stacked column. Now, I'm certainly not going to say this is wrong, and I think we can see pretty readily what's going on here. We can see, even though this isn't the best layout, we can see pretty readily that the South is our top performer. Whether retail or wholesale, we see that they're in two different ways. If, keeping an eye on the chart and our data, if we switch region and sales type again, the relative locations, here it comes out maybe even stronger. But what if we stack the data? Now recognize something else that's a little bit different. As we click the pivot chart, we've got an Analyze tab. We've been seeing these all along with our pivot tables. But the Design tab looks quite a bit different here. Got a Format tab. Design tab. And what's happening to some of our other features? If we wanted to get to some of our subtotal features and report layout features, we have to click within the pivot table. And now the Design tab looks quite a bit different. So recognize, here's the Design tab when the active cell is in the pivot table. Click on the chart. The Design tab relates to charting and not pivot table features. So that could be a little confusing maybe. But here's what I want to get at with the idea. Change the chart type. I think most times when you created a pivot chart, you want to at least consider the second column chart option called stacked column. You can double click this. There we are. And that brings out, it makes the charts easier to read. It collapses them in terms of complexity and makes it easier. Once again, if I switch the sales type and region fields into their opposite locations, it brings out the detail this way. This certainly tells us off the bat that retail is bigger. Maybe the South doesn't quite jump at us in the same way, but that's okay. Now, in both of these examples here, and I'll just press Control Z, Control Z, Control Y. The actual data is pretty small. I'm not saying that's bad, because at certain times we want our pivot tables to be compact, give us the big picture here, that sort of thing. But as soon as we start adding more than a couple of fields, it seems as if our pivot table might be okay, but the chart starts getting out of hand. Now, I wouldn't say that's an unworkable chart, but it's not looking so good. And again, sometimes you're clamoring for more space here, and we just don't have it. I'll make it wider. Now that is a stacked column, but I'm not thinking it's so great. I'm going to switch the locations of region and clothing type. Region, clothing type. We can do that. Not a whole lot better, I don't think. So I may be clouding your view of what a pivot chart can do. Nevertheless, I think it can be useful at times. You just want to be on the lookout for, am I showing too much data and is the chart helping? So when the pivot table tends to not have too many fields involved, I think you can make a case for dealing with charts and pivot charts. And you can create them at any time simply by clicking within the data and pressing Alt F1. A great shortcut, by the way, for creating charts outside of pivot tables as well, too. If you'd like to create a pivot chart on a separate sheet, simply click within the pivot table and press the F11 key. And that will give us a chart on the separate sheet. So we can work with that too, if we prefer. I think most people won't. And by the way, too, on charts, either here or when it's right next to your data, you can click the drop arrow and get to filtering items here. Let's just show here, not everything, but shoes and belts, ties. So we're just showing that data. And in this case too, the look might not have changed a whole lot, but we're only looking at certain clothing types here. It did change the scaling. So I'll press Control Z here. Instead of going to 500,000, now we're going to 1.6 million. So we can work with our charts that way too. I'll go back to the pivot table itself, and here we are. And of course, we can do the filtering here, same way. And over here under sales type, if we only want to see retail, unselect all, choose retail only. So we're seeing the data that way. Same thing with region. So we can do filtering within the pivot chart as well as within the pivot table. So there's certainly a lot of flexibility. And in all cases, changes we make to the chart get reflected in the table. Changes in the pivot table get reflected in the chart itself. So lots of options here as we work with this data. All right, I want to go back here and essentially recreate the data without filtering. So fast way could be, come back here, select all, in the pivot table. We're seeing all of our regions, we're seeing all of our clothing types. Let's make clothing type be a row, labels, or a rows field, and region be the columns field. And once again, sales type is a row field. There we are. Now, in a few other examples, we saw how we didn't want subtotals. Maybe we do want them. Now, once again, on the chart here, we might keep this around at different times. We might refer to it. I'm just going to sort of put it in the background a little bit. But let's focus on this idea. And there's a feature in here that might surprise you too, because it's really not documented and it's not intuitive. We don't have subtotals right now, but say we want them. Design tab, left button, subtotals. And you'll notice two choices. Show all subtotals at bottom of group. Okay, that sounds good. Let's do that. So, and let me contrast this. We now have a retail total right here. We got a wholesale total. Earlier we didn't see that. I'll simply press Control Z to remind you what it looked like. And then Control Y to go the other direction. We see what's happening there. Now, the other option here under subtotals is show all subtotals at top of group. Let's do that. And what happens? Nothing. So what's going on here? If you use tabular view, you cannot see totals at the top. Now, I don't know why that is, and I certainly don't think it flows out of any innate logic or any kind of intuition here. But if we go back to report layout and choose either compact or outline, we will get subtotals on top. Show an outline form. And now we've got our retail totals on top. Now, who would ever know that? You might discover it, as I did a few years ago. I haven't seen it documented. I haven't been strongly looking for it, but there it is. And so If you prefer to have subtotals at the top of a list, like we see here, remember, this is the total for retail, and then below it, here are those numbers. So if I highlight these numbers right here, for example, in the status bar at the bottom of the screen, because we've highlighted 2 or more cells, we see a total down there. It's 903,000. So there it is. And that's that number, but it's sitting on top of the data. If you want these below the data, it's going to work in this view. We can go back to subtotals, show them at the bottom of the group. There they are at the bottom instead. So either way. Now we can flip them either way when we have the report layout in outline form. But when we have the report layout in tabular form, we can only have the retail totals on the bottom. Now, I usually don't care myself. I tend to prefer to put them on the bottom, and I usually use tabular anyway, but that just points out one of the differences that you wouldn't instinctively know as you work with the data here. But it reminds us again of the different ways that we can display information.